By the time they reached the ranch, the sky was dark, scattered with stars. The house stood at the edge of the land, its outlines stark against the night. It wasn't much, just a wooden structure built with his own hands, a roof to keep the rain out and walls that sometimes groaned in the wind. To him, it had always been enough. But as he helped her down from the wagon, he saw it through her eyes for the first time. Lonely, empty, a shell waiting to be. Filled, she looked at the house without a word. Her face revealed little, but her gaze lingered on the doorway, as though she was measuring the life she was about to step into. He led her inside, lighting the lamp that cast a faint glow over the single room. The shadows stretched across the walls, swallowing corners that had never seemed so dark before. He gestured toward the table, rough-hewn and scarred from years of use. "It's not much," he admitted, almost ashamed, "but it's home." She set her small case by the door and moved toward the table, her fingers brushing across its surface. She didn't smile, yet there was no disappointment in her expression either. Instead, she seemed to study everything with quiet acceptance, as though she had already expected less than what she found. That unsettled him even more. He busied himself with small tasks, lighting the stove, setting water to boil, anything to avoid the silence pressing down on them. She sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching him with that same unreadable calm. He felt her eyes following his movements, and it made his chest tighten. He wasn't used to being studied like that, not by anyone. Finally, he sat across from her, the firelight flickering between them. He cleared his throat. "I don't know much about your ways," he said slowly, careful with each word, "but I'll do right by you. That's what I can promise." For the first time since stepping off the train, a faint smile touched her lips, small and fleeting, but enough to make his heart lurch. "That is all anyone can promise," she replied. Her words stayed with him, echoing long after the fire died down and the room fell into shadows again. He lay awake that night, listening to the sound of the wind against the walls, her presence only a few feet away, and yet feeling as though she was still a world apart. Sleep came late, restless and shallow, filled with dreams he didn't dare name. The days that followed brought routine, yet nothing felt the same. She moved quietly through the house, her steps light but sure. She learned the rhythm of the ranch quickly, watching, listening, then doing without being told. He found her outside at dawn, gathering water before he could lift the bucket, or in the fields by midday, her hands working with a grace that surprised him. She spoke little, but her silence was not empty. It was full of intent, as if she was measuring everything and everyone around her. The townsfolk began to talk. Whispers followed them whenever they went into town for supplies. Some were curious, some suspicious, a few openly unkind. He could feel the weight of their stares whenever she walked beside him, her head held high despite the looks. More than once, he felt the urge to snap back at the muttered comments, but she never flinched. Her calmness seemed to silence him before he could act. Still, the tension grew. He had thought life would grow easier with someone to share it, but instead, he felt the ground shifting beneath him. She was not the plain bride he had imagined, someone who would fade into the background of his days. She brought something else entirely, something he couldn't yet name, and it unsettled him in ways he couldn't ignore. At night, as the wind howled outside, he lay awake wondering about her past. He wondered what she had left behind, what had driven her to cross the ocean for a man she had never met. But she never spoke of it, and he did not ask. It was as though some unspoken line had been drawn between them, one that neither dared to cross. One evening, after a long day on the range, he found her standing near the fence, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The sun was sinking, casting long shadows over the land. He walked up beside her, leaning against the fence post, unsure of what to say. Finally, he asked, "Do you miss it? Your home?" She didn't look at him. Her gaze stayed on the fading light. "Home is not always a place," she said softly. "Sometimes it is something you carry inside. Sometimes it is something you are still searching for." Her words struck him harder than he expected. He had never thought of home as anything more than a roof and a piece of land. But the way she said it made him realize that her journey wasn't just about coming here. It was about finding something she hadn't yet found. He wanted to ask if she thought she could find it here, with him, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he only nodded, staring at the horizon with her. The silence stretching between them once again. The days turned into weeks. And though they grew more accustomed to one another, the tension remained. He felt it every time their eyes met, every time her hand brushed his by accident, every time the townsfolk whispered as they passed. He couldn't ignore the truth any longer. She had stirred something in him he wasn't ready to face, and yet he couldn't turn away from it either. And then came the night that changed everything. The wind was fierce, rattling the windows and sending dust swirling across the land. He had just finished stabling the horses when he saw her standing in the doorway, her figure framed by the lamplight inside. There was something in her eyes that made his breath catch. Something he couldn't name but knew would alter the course of everything. As he stepped toward her, the storm howled louder, the land itself seeming to brace for what was coming. He knew then that whatever path lay ahead would not be simple, not safe, not plain. It would be filled with fire and questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. But it was already too late to turn back. The night held its breath, and so did he. Waiting for the words she was about to speak, the task is to continue at about 1,200 words, while keeping the tone in line with the old American West style. The focus is on developing tensions around a Chinese mail-order bride, her perspective, and the male rancher's viewpoint. I also need to build on the subplots involving townsfolk, like the widow, sheriff, and others, without resolving conflicts yet. Just maintaining suspense. I'll make sure to avoid too much graphic content and steer clear of harmful stereotypes. The main conflict is shaping up with a land dispute involving a cattle baron and prejudice from the townsfolk. There's a sense of mystery about the woman's past, including a letter and a jade pendant. Subplots involve a friend at the Chinese laundry and possibly a miner named Lao, to avoid naming real people. I'm sticking with general labels like the blacksmith or the storekeeper, but can also use simpler names: Eli, Nora, Hank, etc. The story picks up with her revealing a letter, hinting at danger and asking to leaven him, protecting her, but feeling conflicted. I'll add the growing tension of the cattle syndicate wanting water rights while he resists. Ending on a cliffhanger adds to the suspense. Done. The storm rattled the door as she stood there, small figure against the lamplight. Her hands were steady, but her eyes carried the kind of strain that comes from holding back truths for too long. She spoke first, not with grand news, only a simple line that pulled the air from his lungs. She said someone would come looking for her. She didn't know when. She didn't know from what direction. She only knew the train brought more than freight and passengers. It carried messages, debts, and promises, and one of those had her name tied to it. The wind groaned against the eaves while his thoughts raced. She went to the table and set down a thin envelope, worn soft at the folds. The paper bore a foreign stamp and a smudge of soot from the rail. She watched him the way a person watches a bridge in flood. He did not reach for the letter. He studied her instead. The old American house suddenly felt too small for so many questions. She told him the writing inside was not a threat by itself. It was a reminder. There had been a bargain made before she left, one that had not been honored by someone she once trusted. Now others wanted their due. The days that followed carried the taste of that confession. Windmill blades creaked, cattle lowed along the fence line, and the prairie stretched calm as ever, yet nothing felt safe. He took to riding the boundary lines more often, scanning the ridge for riders who did not belong. She kept to the ranch chores without complaint, but he noticed how she paused at the sound of the telegraph clicks drifting over the flats from town. She had begun placing her case under the bed each night, as if a ready bag were a kind of shield. The suspense sat between them like a third person. Whispers in town grew thicker. The storekeeper measured nails and flour with an easy smile, but his eyes cut toward the door each time it opened. The blacksmith chewed a toothpick and asked careless questions that were not careless. The new sheriff, a man with a crisp badge and boots polished too often, greeted them with a nod that felt like a warning. Rumor tied her presence to all manner of fancies. Mail-order bride, runaway, east wind trouble. A few voices muttered that the rancher should keep to his own kind. That last part tightened his jaw until his teeth ached. A second trouble slid quietly into their days. Drought pressed its thumb on the land, and water dropped inch by inch in the creek bed. The cattle baron south of town had a long reach and a longer memory. He wanted to buy out the smaller spreads before the prairie turned hard. He sent men with soft hands to talk first, men who wore tidy coats and claimed friendship. They offered a price that sounded fair until a person counted the work it took to make the land worth anything. When the rancher refused, the men offered advice. Take the money now. Weather's fickle and fences are foolish. The advice felt like a threat wrapped in polite paper. She listened as those men spoke, her gaze on the ledger she had begun keeping for the ranch. The numbers were neat in her hand, steady as fence posts. When the men left, she showed him entries from the last cattle drive. Tally marks did not match what he remembered. Weigh slips carried small differences that would be easy to overlook. Her finger traced a short list of names tied to the rail office. Not proof. Not yet. But the shape of a quiet theft sat clear in her eyes. He felt the ground shift again, this time under the weight of a newer kind of enemy. Not drought or wind. A man with a pen and friends in the courthouse. A small subplot began to bloom at the edge of town. A widow who ran the boarding house had a little girl who rarely spoke. The child hid behind door frames whenever strangers passed. She had seen a fight behind the livery last winter and carried that memory like a stone. The Chinese girl brought cloth scraps from home and showed the child how to fold them into small birds. Day by day, the child followed her into the kitchen, then to the porch, then down the road as far as the cottonwoods. The widow watched with tears she tried to hide, grateful yet worried. Folks who bring light sometimes attract shadows. Another thread spun out at the rail yard. The telegraph clerk, a man whose fingers tapped faster than his thoughts, grew friendly with the rancher's hired hand. He liked to talk when the day dragged. He mentioned to no one in particular that a wire had come from the coast asking about a passenger who matched her description. The clerk didn't know who sent it. He only knew the inquiry had moved along the line like a fish sliding through water. The hired hand carried that news home, his voice low. The girl listened without blinking, but her knuckles turned white around the cup she held. She began to share pieces of herself in short, clear lines. Not a full history. Just fragments. A father who traded in tea and books. A fire that took more than wood. A promise made by a friend of the family who said he could secure safe passage to America. Money changed hands. Not all of it reached the ship. Someone lied. Fear swelled until it found a second bargain with strangers who knew how to move people and papers. The man who failed her on the first promise now needed her silence. There were debts back home that wore her name like a tag. She did not say more. He did not push. The prairie had its own language for pain. By late summer, a steer turned up missing from the north pasture. Then another. Tracks showed riders crossing the range at night, smart enough to stay under the ridge. The rancher found the remains of a campfire near the creek, buried under a mound of sand. He stood over it at dawn while the sky lay pale and cold. The prints were light. Men who knew the land left them. He returned home with his jaw clenched and the wind in his ears. The baron's men again, or rustlers, who would sell to the baron and claim ignorance when tested. Either way, the creek ran lower each week, and the herd grew restless. She did something then that made him look at her with new eyes. She rode with him at dusk, keeping pace even when the ground broke rough. She studied the wind, the lay of the grass, the turn of the cattle's heads. She said the herd looked toward the old gully each evening, as if scenting a trail. He had not noticed. Together they stalked the ridge and found where a fence had been cut and wired back. It's just enough to pass a few animals at a time. The work was clean. No drunken slashes. Someone with steady hands and patience had been coming and going. He felt a heat rise in his chest that had nothing to do with the sun. In town, the sheriff changed his tone. He began to visit the ranch uninvited, asking after papers and permits that no one else ever needed. He hinted at trouble coming if the rancher did not show respect to the larger interests of the county. Respect was a word that tasted like dust. The rancher kept his voice calm and his hands still, but the girls sensed the line being drawn. On the way back from one such visit, she stopped at the small laundry run by two cousins who kept mostly to themselves. She spoke to them quietly in a language that rolled like water. They looked startled, then thoughtful, then wary. She left with a folded note tucked into her sleeve. Nights grew heavy with watchfulness. Coyotes called, and the barn creaked, and every shadow felt like a rider waiting beyond the fence. The hired hand slept in the loft with a lantern ready. The girl kept the ledger close, adding to it after supper while wind pressed against the shutters. He studied her bent over those pages, the lamplight catching the red thread in her dress, and knew that whatever came would test them both past comfort. He wondered if the letter from the coast was the first drip of a larger wave. He wondered if the Baron's men would try the house rather than the pasture next time. He wondered if he could keep them safe with nothing more than grit and a stubborn streak. Another subplot unfolded at the church picnic. The town had a way of pretending peace, even when trouble simmered. Tables lined the yard, pies cooling, children racing under cottonwoods. The widow's little girl clung to the Chinese dress, tense until the paper birds appeared, then smiling. A group of ranch hands from the south side drifted close. Jokes turned pointed. One of the men asked if the rancher knew how foreign debts sometimes got settled. Another mentioned water rights, smiling the whole time. The sheriff watched from the shade and did not move. The rancher's hand clenched around a tin plate until it bent. The girl stepped slightly forward, not cowering, only standing. That tiny shift drew eyes from every direction. The next morning a message waited at the rail office addressed to the rancher. It carried no signature. It named a time and a place near the gully where the fence had been cut. If he wanted the missing cattle back, he should come alone. If he wanted peace, he should listen. No lawman, no questions. The handwriting was tidy and patient. She read it twice, then met his eyes with a calm that masked worry. He said he would go. She said he should not. He said leaving it unanswered would invite worse. She folded the paper and slid it into the ledger, then looked toward the horizon the way she had that first night. He rode out before dawn, the world gray with cold. She stood at the doorway watching until he dropped behind the rise. She returned inside and pulled the note from the ledger. On the back she drew a small map of the ridge where she guessed men would hide. She had learned the land quickly. She tucked the map into her sleeve and waited 1 hour, then saddled the mare. She told the hired hand to keep the lantern ready and the door barred until she returned. He argued. She shook her head, voice quiet yet unbendable. She left at a steady pace, riding low across the flats where the sagebrush could shelter a body from prying eyes. From the ridge he saw the gully and the small black knot of riders waiting. He counted 3 at first, then spotted a 4th crouched near the cut fence. Their coats were plain, faces hidden under brims. He did not dismount. One rider stepped forward and raised a hand in greeting, the gesture strangely graceful. They spoke of cattle first, as if this were a neighborly matter. Then water, then taxes. The rider said the Baron could be a friend to a man who knew the world had changed. The rancher felt the world change again inside his chest. The rider finally mentioned the girl. The rider said debts travel, even across oceans. Silence fell like a curtain. Her heart pounded as she reached the shadow of the ridge. She dismounted and climbed the last stretch on foot, keeping low. From a crack between rocks she saw the 4 riders facing him. She recognized one by the way his gloved hand lifted and fell with every sentence. The rancher could feel it building, the moment when everything would snap. The deputy's hand hovered near his belt. The 4th man at the fence kept his coat tight. The gloved riders stared at her with a fury that promised no forgiveness. The dust cloud thickened as the circle of men tightened. The rancher's palm itched against his pistol grip. He knew the clash was coming, but he also knew this wasn't only his fight. It was hers too, and the stakes ran deeper than land or cattle. At the ranch house, hoofbeats finally reached the yard. More riders, their silhouettes cutting sharp against the sun. The stranger turned to greet them, as if expecting company. His smile returned, smoother than before, his voice rising in greeting. The hired hand backed toward the barn door, trying to shield the child. The stranger tipped his hat as if welcoming allies. The tension hung in the air like lightning waiting for the strike in the gully. The rancher and the girl stood side by side, caught between two groups ready to close in. Her eyes never left the gloved rider, his never left hers. The deputy raised his hand higher, his command seconds from spilling into chaos. The rancher felt his muscles coil, his whole body braced. The prairie held its breath. The storm of men and dust was about to break. And in that thin, fragile moment before the first shot or the first charge, the story balanced on the sharpest edge of suspense. The gully trembled with tension. Every rider, every horse, waiting for the signal that would decide their fate. The deputy's hand hovered near his belt. The gloved rider sat rigid in his saddle, and the circle of men pressed in tighter. Dust spun in the air like smoke, blotting out the last rays of sun. The rancher's breath came slow and steady, his hand brushing the worn grip of his pistol. Though his eyes stayed fixed on the faces before him, beside him, the girl stood tall, her chin lifted. Her eyes locked on the man who had once held her life in his palm and betrayed it. When she spoke again, her words came sharp and clear, cutting through the wind. She told him that the debt he carried was not just to her, but to every promise broken, every coin pocketed, every family left in ruin by his greed. She spoke not in anger but in truth, and her calmness carried more weight than any shouted threat. The deputy shifted in his saddle, uneasy, his badge catching the last glimmer of light. Even his authority wavered in the face of such certainty. The gloved rider tried to laugh, but the sound cracked. He raised his hand to give a command, but before it could fall, the rancher stepped forward, his voice deep and steady. "You've taken cattle, water, and honor, but you won't take her." His words hung heavy, each one anchored in the dirt beneath their feet. The circle hesitated, riders glancing at each other, doubt creeping in like a shadow. Men followed strength, and strength was shifting. Then the first shot rang out. Not from the rancher, not from the deputy, but from the fourth man near the fence. His pistol flared, the bullet striking a post and sending splinters into the air. Chaos erupted. Horses screamed, riders scattered, dust rose in a blinding storm. The rancher pulled his pistol, firing back to drive the attackers off, while the girl dove behind a rock, her eyes sharp, scanning for movement. The deputy shouted orders. But his men broke apart, some loyal to the Baron, others unwilling to fight a battle that had already soured. The gloved rider wheeled his horse, trying to rally, but the girl's voice cut through again, fierce and unyielding. She shouted his name, and for a moment, hesitation flickered in his eyes. It was enough. The rancher fired, striking the ground near his horse, sending the animal rearing. The rider lost his seat, falling hard into the dust. His men pulled back, dragging him with them, their formation breaking into retreat. The deputy cursed, his badge flashing as he galloped away, unwilling to stand against the tide that had turned. Silence fell slowly, broken only by the fading thunder of hooves. The rancher lowered his pistol, chest heaving, eyes sweeping the gully for threats. The girl rose from behind the rock, her dress torn at the hem, her face streaked with dust, but her eyes still burning with the same steady fire. They met in the center of the gully, the air between them, heavy with all that had passed. Neither spoke at first. Words felt too small for what had just been faced together. Back at the ranch, the stranger on the porch heard the gunfire and knew the plan had cracked. His smooth smile vanished. When the riders who had approached turned uncertain, unsure whether to press or retreat, he made his choice. He mounted his horse and rode off without another word, his polished boots flashing once before vanishing in the trail of dust. The hired hand stood on the porch, lantern hooks still clenched, relief washing over him as the last of the danger passed. The widow's little girl stepped forward, her small bird still clutched in her hand, and whispered that the bad men were gone. In the days that followed, the prairie seemed quieter, though scars lingered. Fences had to be mended, cattle tallied, trust rebuilt. The Baron's men stayed away, the lesson of the gully fresh in their minds. The deputy's crooked badge was nowhere to be seen in town, rumors swirling that he had ridden out for good. The telegraph clerk stopped asking careless questions. His tapping fingers stilled whenever the rancher walked by. The stranger in the traveling coat was never seen again. The whispers said he had been sent back east with his tail between his legs. The girl kept the ledger open on the table each night, her neat handwriting filling page after page. She marked every expense, every sale, every head of cattle, building a record too solid to be twisted. The rancher watched her sometimes, the lamplight catching the calm determination in her face, and he realized she had brought not only courage but also order, a steady line in the chaos of the West. The widow's little girl visited often, her paper birds multiplying across the shelves and windowsills of the ranch house. She smiled more now, her laughter chasing away the shadows that had haunted her. The widow herself found comfort in the company, and soon the kitchen smelled of shared meals, the sound of voices filling the once lonely walls. What had been an empty house became a home, one where silence was no longer heavy but peaceful. Yet not all wounds closed easily. The rancher still carried the weight of the confrontation, the memory of standing in that gully with his life balanced on a thread. At night, he sometimes woke with the echo of hooves in his ears, the image of riders pressing in. But each time he found her there, steady and unshaken, her presence anchoring him back to the present. He knew then that whatever storms might come, he would not face them alone. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of gold and crimson, he stood with her at the edge of the field. The land stretched wide and untamed, the fences mended, the cattle grazing in calm rhythm. He looked at her, her face turned toward the horizon, the same horizon she had stared at that first night. He asked her quietly if she had found what she was searching for. She turned to him, her dark eyes steady, and said that home was not something one carried alone. It was something built, piece by piece, with trust, with labor, with love. She had not expected to find it here at the edge of the prairie, but she had. Her words settled in his chest like a brand, burning truth into him. The town slowly came to accept what it had first resisted. They saw her strength, her quiet dignity, her willingness to work beside him through drought and storm. The whispers faded, replaced by nods of respect. Some still held their prejudice, but even they could not deny the change she brought to the ranch and to the man himself. Where once he had walked with only his shadow, now he walked with her by his side. And together they carried a weight no storm could bend. Seasons turned. Grass grew tall again after the drought, the creek filled with spring rain. Calves were born into the world with the same stubborn will that had carried their keepers through trial. The rancher and the girl lived each day with the knowledge of what had nearly been lost, and it gave every sunrise a sharper meaning. They had faced betrayal, greed, and fear, and in the end, they had built something greater than survival. The widow's child, now braver than before, often played under the cottonwoods with the ranch dogs at her heels. The hired hand told and retold the story of the gully, always with more detail than truth, but always ending with the line that the girl's courage had turned the tide. And the townsfolk, when they passed the ranch, tipped their hats not only to him, but to her, acknowledging the heart that had changed everything. As for the gloved rider, his name carried no power anymore. His betrayal was spoken of only in hushed tones, a reminder of what greed could cost. The letter she had carried, once a mark of debt, was burned in the stove one winter night, the ashes scattering into the wind. She said the past no longer owned her. The rancher stood beside her, his hand covering hers, and together they let it go. Years later, when the train whistle echoed across the plains, he would remember the day she stepped off the platform, the day he had expected a plain bride and found instead the woman who changed his life forever. He would remember the fire in her eyes, the silence that spoke louder than words, the courage that stood unbroken in the face of every storm. And he would give thanks that fate had carried her to him, not plain, not simple, but strong, brave, and his. The West was never gentle, never forgiving, but it had given him the one gift he had never dared hope for. And as the prairie wind swept across the land, carrying with it the scent of grass and earth, he knew their story would endure, woven into the wide sky and endless fields as lasting as the land itself. Conductor keeping time. She remembered a man in a wool coat on the dock, paying a clerk with a folded bill while turning his head just enough to avoid being counted responsible. The wind carried their words in broken pieces. She could not afford to wait for all of them to arrive whole. Back at the ranch, a new figure appeared while the hired hand filled water pails. A stranger in a traveling coat asked for the Chinese girl by description, voice polite as a salesman. He said he carried letters from the coast and a business matter to discuss. The hired hand stalled, eyes on the stranger's boots, which were city-made. The stranger smiled and asked for a seat and a drink while he waited. His gaze swept the house, counting windows and doors. The hired hand felt the skin crawl on his neck. He moved to close the door, but the stranger blocked it with a gentle step that felt practiced. On the ridge, the rider's tone changed. He said an accident could take a man's herd. He said a fire could take a barn. He said a missing person could be hard to find in all that open country. The rancher kept his hands at his sides and his voice even. He said the creek did not belong to one man. He said the fence had been cut and he would close it again. He said the person they spoke of was under his roof and would be treated with respect. The rider tilted his head, amused and cold. He lifted his fingers in a signal. The fourth man near the fence straightened and reached for something under his coat. The rancher tensed to move. She rose from the rocks and sent her voice across the gully like a thrown rope. No one fired. All four riders turned toward the sound, startled by a presence they had not marked. The rancher felt both relief and fear hammer through him. She stepped into view, unarmed, the wind tugging strands of hair loose from the braid. She said the man with the gloved hand should remove his hat. He did, slow and surprised. She looked at his face and gave a small nod, the kind a person makes when memory finally clicks into place. The rider smiled, and that smile told the rancher this was worse than cattle and fences. This was the kind of trouble that keeps crossing oceans until it is paid at the ranch. The hired hand eased the door shut against the stranger's polished boot and reached for the lantern hook he had promised to keep ready. The stranger's polite voice dropped to a level tone. He said the girl had obligations that could no longer be postponed. He said he would take tea if there was any. The hired hand heard hoofbeats far off and prayed they belonged to friends. The stranger heard them too. He adjusted his cuffs and smiled again, as if an appointment had arrived right on time. On the ridge, words sharpened into blades. The rider with the gloved hand spoke her family name like a coin turned in the palm. She gave it back to him without flinching. The rancher stepped closer. The fourth man by the fence moved again, faster this time. The wind stilled, as if the land had leaned in to listen. She lifted her chin and said one line in the language of home that made the rider's eyes flash. He drew breath to answer, but a shout rose from the far side of the gully, and a second group of riders crested the slope, coats flapping, faces hidden against the light. Dust roared up in a brown wall. Horses screamed. The rancher spun to shield her without thinking. And the first rider laughed in a way that sounded too calm for the chaos rushing toward them. Down at the house, the stranger stepped back from the door and turned toward the sound on the road. He straightened his tie, as though preparing for a civil talk. The hired hand gripped the lantern hook until his knuckles turned white, judging whether to hold ground or run for help. The earth seemed to pause between beats, the whole frontier town hovering in that thin space before the next. Choice would decide everything. The dust storm of hooves bore down on the gully, a roar of iron shoes and snorting breath that made the earth shake. The rancher drew his stance tighter, hand ready at his side, though his pistol stayed holstered for now. His eyes darted between the first group of riders and the new arrivals pouring over the ridge. He could not yet tell if these men were friend or foe, only that the balance had tipped, and danger was now twice as thick. The girl stood firm beside him, her braid whipping in the wind, her face unreadable, but her body rigid with focus. She had not flinched even once, though every shadow around them threatened to split wide with violence. The rider with the glove did not waver. He sat tall in the saddle, hat low, mouth bent in a grin that carried no warmth. He welcomed the new riders as if they were expected, lifting a gloved hand to signal them closer. That signal made the rancher's stomach twist. Whoever they were not strangers. Dust clouded the space between groups until faces blurred, voices swallowed by the storm. Still, the rancher could hear enough to know alliances were shifting in ways that left him stranded in the middle. At the ranch house, the stranger in the traveling coat stepped out onto the porch. He tipped his hat toward the sound of riders on the road. His voice was smooth when he spoke to the hired hands still guarding the doorway. "This will be finished one way or another," he said. "I advise you to stand aside." The hired hand's jaw tightened. He gripped the lantern hook harder. The widow's little girl, who had come visiting that afternoon, peeked from behind the kitchen curtain, her small paper bird clutched in her fist. Her wide eyes took in the stranger, the poised way he waited as though this were a parlor meeting rather than the edge of violence. The hired hand whispered for her to stay back, but her presence already added a new weight to the moment. On the ridge above the gully, the girl's voice rose, low but steady. She spoke a line in her language, and though the rancher could not understand, he could feel the strength in it. It was not a plea. It was not surrender. It was a warning. The rider with the glove responded in kind, his words sharp, clipped, his tone rising with a heat that carried across the dry air. The rancher knew then what he had only half guessed before. These two were bound by a past debt, one tangled in betrayal and money that had not reached the right hands. This was not only about cattle or water. This was about blood and honor stretching across the ocean. The second group of riders fanned out, forming a half circle around the gully. Their leader pushed his horse forward, his coat flapping open to reveal the silver badge of a deputy pinned crookedly to his chest. The rancher cursed under his breath. Deputies did not ride out this far without reason. Their presence meant the law was bending, not protecting. The Baron's shadow was long, and now it stretched into the law itself. The deputy called out, voice calm but edged with threat, "This land can't carry everyone. Some of you best make peace with that." The rancher glanced at the girl, his chest tightening. She met his eyes only briefly before turning back toward the riders. She did not look afraid, but she did look resolved, as if she had already chosen her ground. He realized with a sudden ache that she would never bow to fear, no matter how heavy the odds. That thought filled him with both pride and dread. The air seemed to stretch thin, each second pulled longer than it should. Horses stamped, snorted, restless under the tension of their riders. A crow wheeled overhead, its cry splitting the silence. The deputy lifted a hand as if to give a command. The rider with the glove leaned forward in his saddle, eyes locked on the girl. The fourth man near the fence shifted again, hand tight around something hidden under his coat. The rancher's fingers brushed the worn handle of his pistol, but he hesitated. To draw too soon could spark blood. He could not stop. To wait too long might cost more than land or cattle. Back at the ranch, the stranger poured himself water from the bucket, as calm as if sitting in a parlor. He set the tin cup down neatly on the porch rail and turned toward the barn. His eyes lingered on the door where the cattle lowed, uneasy with the storm. "Fine animals," he said with a faint smile. "A pity if the drought took them before a sale could be made." His words cut sharper than any blade. The hired hand moved his stance between the barn and the stranger, the lantern hook raised like a weapon. The stranger did not flinch. His polished boots stayed planted, his smile thin, knowing, patient. The widow's little girl ducked out from the kitchen and ran to the porch, her small paper bird clutched tight. She thrust it at the stranger as if it were a shield. For the first time, the smoothness in his face cracked. He looked down at her, then back at the hired hand, eyes narrowing. "Children should not play near fire," he murmured. The hired hand's grip tightened. He was ready to swing if the man made one wrong move. On the ridge, the gully below seemed to breathe with menace. Dust swirled, sun dipped lower, shadows stretched long and thin. The rancher's mind raced, weighing every angle. The girl's braid lashed in the wind, her chin lifted. She spoke again, her voice cutting through the noise, calling the rider with the glove by name. The name hit the air like a strike of flint. Even the deputy's horse flinched. The gloved rider stiffened, his grin dropping into a line of ice. She had named him as the man who betrayed her family's trust, who pocketed gold meant to secure her passage. who left her fate dangling on the mercy of others. The silence after her words rang louder than the storm. The wind swept across the dusty station, carrying with it the scent of smoke, hot iron, and prairie grass. The little town, with its single dirt road and clapboard storefronts, had grown used to the steady arrival of trains. Each shriek of the whistle meant new goods, new faces, and sometimes new trouble. But on that afternoon, when the long black locomotive came roaring into the station with steam billowing like a storm cloud, no one expected it would deliver a girl who would change the course of a man's life forever. He stood near the platform, hat tilted low against the sun. Vest stretched over his broad chest and jaw set tight. A rancher's strength clung to him, and so did a kind of weariness born from years of work beneath the harsh western sky. He wasn't looking for excitement or romance. He had agreed to something plain and practical, the way a man agrees to take on another mule or add another acre of fence line. A wife, he'd been told, would ease the loneliness, keep the house in order, and share the burdens of the land. He expected simplicity, predictability, someone who would fit quietly into the hard life he already knew. When the train slowed, squealing on the tracks, he watched with mild curiosity. The other townsfolk bustled about, gathering crates and sacks, waving to relatives. Arguing with the station master about late deliveries, his eyes narrowed when a slender figure stepped down, her form framed by the rolling steam. She wore a red silk dress that shimmered like fire under the high sun. Its pattern so delicate it seemed foreign to the dust of the West. Her dark hair fell like a river down her back, and her eyes held a calm strength that stopped him cold. The murmurs of the crowd rippled. Some whispered questions, others gawked outright. She stood with quiet poise, clutching a small case, her gaze traveling over the platform as if searching for someone. That was when she found him. Their eyes locked, and for a moment the chaos of the station faded into silence. He hadn't expected her, not in the least. He had imagined someone plain, perhaps timid, someone whose presence would be as unremarkable as a gray shawl against a winter field. Instead, standing before him was a girl from across the ocean, whose very being seemed to carry the mystery of another world. The sight of her made his chest tighten with something he couldn't name, but if he was stunned, she was unreadable. She offered no smile, no nervous gesture, only a steady gaze that held more fire than he thought possible from someone so small. She had traveled farther than he could imagine, leaving behind all she had known, to step into a land where strangers judged with their eyes before a word was spoken. That kind of courage unsettled him more than any outlaw or rattlesnake ever had. The silence stretched between them until the hiss of the train broke it. He finally moved forward, tipping his hat, his voice rough from disuse. "You must be the one." She gave a single nod, her lips pressing together as though words were unnecessary. And yet, in that moment, something passed between them, something unspoken but powerful. He felt it deep, a current pulling him where he hadn't meant to go. The station master eyed them curiously, smirk tugging at his mustache as if he knew the stir this meeting would cause in town. Behind them, the locomotive released another blast of steam, sending the air hot and thick between them. She didn't flinch. He found himself admiring that, though he didn't dare admit it aloud, as he reached for her small case. Their fingers brushed, and the simple touch sparked a charge he wasn't prepared for. His hand lingered a second too long before he cleared his throat and turned toward the wagon. She followed her steps, graceful and silent, like a shadow gliding over the earth. The town watched. He could feel their eyes boring into his back, their questions whispered in voices they thought he couldn't hear. Why her? Why here? Some faces held curiosity, others suspicion. And though he pretended not to notice, he knew this was only the beginning of what would come. As they left the platform behind, the sound of the train faded into the distance, but the weight of her presence remained, pressing on him like the desert sun. He stole a glance at her as she walked beside him. She didn't look afraid, though perhaps she had reason to be. She didn't look eager either, though this land was so different from her own. Instead, she looked steady, as though she carried with her a strength the West itself would have to reckon with. He thought of the days ahead, of the hard work and silence that would fill their hours. He thought of the house waiting at the edge of his ranch, empty but for a chair, a bed, and the creak of floorboards. He had pictured a woman fitting easily into that emptiness, blending into it like another tool on the shelf. But he already knew this girl would not fade into the background. She would not be plain, not in presence, not in spirit. And though the thought unsettled him, it also stirred something alive in his chest. Something he had long forgotten how to feel. They reached the wagon, and he helped her up, careful not to meet her eyes this time. As he climbed in beside her and took the reins, the horses stamped impatiently, sensing the tension between their riders. The road stretched before them, long and lonely, leading out into the wilds where only the toughest dared to settle. The wheels creaked as they rolled away from the station, dust rising in their wake. The town shrank behind them, though he could still feel the weight of its watchful gaze. He tried to focus on the road, but he could feel her presence at his side, quiet and constant. She turned her face toward the horizon, and the sinking sun caught in her dark hair, making it shine like polished coal. He wanted to ask her what she was thinking, what she saw when she looked at this untamed land. He wanted to know what kind of courage it took to cross an ocean for a man she'd never met, but his throat tightened, and the words stuck. Instead, silence settled over them, heavy but not empty, filled with things left unsaid. As the wagon jolted over a rut, she finally spoke, her voice soft but clear. "Is it far?" He glanced at her, caught off guard by the question. Her eyes met his again, steady, waiting. For a moment, he forgot the reins in his hands, forgot the horses pulling them forward. He only knew the way her voice lingered in the air, low and sure, carrying more promise than he was ready to face. He swallowed hard, nodding once. Far enough the road stretched on, the sun dipped lower, and the shadows of evening began to creep across the land. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, its cry haunting in the fading light. He tightened his grip on the reins, knowing deep down that whatever lay ahead, his life would never be the same again, and as the horizon swallowed the sun, he realized with a jolt of unease that the story he thought he had chosen for himself was no longer his to control. Would she break under the weight of this land, or would she bend it to her will? Would the fire in her eyes fade, or would it burn him alive? He didn't know, and that not knowing twisted something inside him. The night closed in, and with it came the whisper of change carried on the desert wind. That was the moment he understood. The girl who stepped off the train had not only entered his life, she had claimed it, and whether he wanted it or not, nothing would ever be plain again. The wagon rolled steadily over the rough dirt road, each turn of the wheel carrying them farther from the noise of the station and deeper into the silence of the wide-open land. The prairie stretched endlessly on both sides, golden under the fading light. The sky bled into shades of purple and red, the kind of sunset that made the west seem both beautiful and unforgiving. He kept his eyes forward, yet every so often he felt her gaze on him, quiet but sharp. As though she was weighing everything she saw, she had asked if it was far. But that was only one of the many questions hanging between them. He wanted to ask her about her home, about what she had left behind, but he wasn't sure if she would answer. He wasn't sure if he could even find the right words. His life had been simple up until now, built on cattle, weather, and work that left his body tired and his thoughts plain. Her arrival cracked through that simplicity like a hammer against stone. He didn't yet know what would spill out from the break. The horses snorted, tossing their heads as if sensing his unease. He tightened the reins and guided them forward, the creak of leather and wood the only sound between them for a long while. Finally, she broke the silence again, her voice soft but steady. "This land is very different." He glanced at her. She was staring at the horizon, where the last line of sunlight lingered before surrendering to the night. Her words carried no judgment, only observation, but they made him realize just how much she must feel like a stranger here. He cleared his throat, his voice rough. "It takes some getting used to." She nodded once, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her calmness unnerved him. Most newcomers looked at the prairie with fear or awe. but she studied it with the kind of quiet patience that suggested she had faced harder things before. He wanted to ask what those things were, but something in her stillness held him back.